There we go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our OD Talk number, Christo, 18.
Yeah, I think so.
Right, I can tell you it is 18.
Okay, thanks.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so today we thought the people from Worldsphere has been so privileged to be in so many conversations for the past 6 months that we want to share some of that. We started early, I think it was in the week that we were asked to start working from home. It was before the official lockdown. We were supposed to have a real cafe at the office, and we decided there's no ways we're not going to not do anything. So we had our first online cafe. And we realized the cafes are so interactive, and there's so much conversation and stuff going on that the platform doesn't really lend it to exactly the same design and feel, but that we would still like to check in regularly. So from the next day, we literally had a check-in every morning from 9 to 10 with anybody that wants to join. And in the beginning, there were usually about 15 to 20 people on those calls. And we kept going with that for about 2.5, almost 3 months. And then we reduced the morning check-ins to Mondays and Fridays. And somewhere in the middle of that, we decided that every Wednesday, in honor of our cafes that we miss so much, we will invite speakers and talk about interesting topics. So what we want to share today, and we'd love for it to be a conversation, not just us talking, is what we've heard over the 6 months from the morning check-ins and from the OD Cafe. So what we thought the themes were that we heard throughout. Some of those stayed the same. Some of those have changed a lot. Some of those have started playing out in different areas. Some of them makes more sense now. Some of them makes way less sense now. But what are those themes that we heard? So we're not here to give answers because we don't have them. We're here to share with you what we heard, what we learned, to ask you, have you heard the same? If you have, how have you been handling it? What have you seen in your clients? How have they been handling it? And is there anything we're missing? And we, the four of us, Richard, Roy, Christo and me, have, as preparation for this session, gone through 6 months of notes of it was a lot. I after 2 hours yesterday, I was only at the 20th of April. So there was a lot of notes and a lot of interesting things. And it was actually so amazing to go back to the notes from the beginning. And then we came together and we said, what were the themes that we heard? And what are the ones that stood out for us, and which of the talks stood out for us? And we decided that each of us has a sort of a theme that we're concentrating on today, but I have an idea that there's so much similarity and alignment and overlap that it is just going to be a conversation. And we thought that we would start with leadership. And right in the beginning, it was even before we were properly in lockdown. Lockdown was just announced. The notes from those check-ins were that leaders were either over-communicating or under-communicating. And they were either quite friendly and concerned and empathetic about their staff, or the complete opposite. Where we had people on the call who, they got blanket emails that salaries are being cut by 25% this month. And if you have a problem with this, speak to your manager. And one of the people on the call was actually a manager, and she had no way of knowing this was coming. So there was like just uncomfortable conversation, and there was anger. And what we saw then was that the leaders were almost becoming the scapegoats. They were to blame for everything that wasn't happening. And we were thinking and talking about, but shame, you know, these leaders are also just people. And they are just people who's also going through something that they've never experienced before. This is a world that nobody's ever experienced before, and they don't necessarily have the answers. So I want to ask Christo to elaborate on the leadership theme a little bit, and just say, yeah, what we heard and the key takeaways from some of the talks, and then we can go into conversation.
Liezel. Yeah, I guess for myself, as we went through this time and thinking about leadership, I think there's some things that I thought I knew about leadership before this period, and that much of that thinking has come under pressure. It has been disrupted. You know, what does it mean to support leaders? What does it mean to develop leaders? And what happens when leaders go into crisis? And what can be done in those spaces. So I've just looked back at Sonia's talk. Sonia and Ingrid had a talk very early on. I think it was the 20th of May. And Sonia had a very interesting concept. She spoke about the leadership double bind, that leaders are in a double bind. And basically means that they are facing a context of truly unresolvable challenges. Double bind, you know, the concept double bind comes from Gregory Bateson, and basically it means you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It doesn't. The system is set up in such a way that whatever choice you make, there's going to be trouble, there's going to be difficulty, there's going to be complexity for you. And I think as we went into this situation, and what we heard as well, is that I think leaders came up against situations where they absolutely really did not know what to do. They couldn't make a simple decision. They couldn't follow all their old heuristics. They couldn't, it's one of the things that Sonia mentioned is this need for control. She mentioned an addiction to control. And I think in many organizations before the lockdown, that sort of often the leadership habit is, I need to control things. I need to make sure that things go in the right direction. Now, if you want to control things, you need to sort of understand the context. You need to know exactly what happens in the context, and you need to have a pretty clear sense of cause and effect. If I do this, that's going to happen. And suddenly we sit in a space where the context is not stable, and you actually don't know what's going to happen. You know, you've got to get the business, you've got to keep the business going on the one hand, but on the other hand, you don't know how long this thing is going to last. And you've got to save cash in the business. And you have to keep your people, but also you can't keep all the people. And it's truly, truly deep, difficult paradoxes that people have been facing. And what is it that leaders do in that space? What is it that they do? What is it that they can do? They basically they basically want to fall back to what they know has been working for them. So I think in one of the organizations, some of the things that people were saying was really around the leaders not communicating and micro-controlling. One of the things that we heard a lot at the beginning was absolute panic almost from leaders, that they can't see the people every day, and that they don't know that people are working. which tells you, I think, a lot more about what happened before than during. During is just sort of an expression of what happened before. I don't know, did they think that before the lockdown, when everyone has the office, they had an idea of what people were doing and that they were in control of what people were doing? So in a way, the crisis ripped away that illusion of control. And what do you do then? So that's one of the very difficult things that happened, I think, with leaders. And then we had a chat to Liezel Greef, and it was about leadership fallback. And the idea around leadership fallback is that, well, first of all, there's the idea of leadership maturity and the development of leadership maturity. So as we grow older, that's one of the parts, but that's not a guarantee. As we grow older and as we develop cognitively and emotionally, and we are able to confront more complexity. And we become less defensive, which is a necessary condition for confronting complexity. If we want to confront or come to terms with complexity, we have to give up on certain defensive notions inside ourselves, like we can know everything, we can control outcomes, we can control teams, etc. And we grow out of that. We start to include more possibilities, more paradox, and of course we also start to include a little bit about our own shadow side. Now, as we go into crisis, and this is a well-studied phenomenon, we fall back to earlier stages, and we experience it as a loss of agency. And it is a loss of agency. It feels like the only things that we have to go on is the stuff that somewhere deep in the past used to work for us. And it suddenly doesn't work for us, but at the same time, we also don't have access to this conceptual and emotional engagement with complexity. And I think the bottom line that came out of those two talks with Sonia and Liezel was, yes, indeed, leaders are human beings, and they do what all human beings do, which is when they go into crisis, they react in certain ways. And those reactions may just be a fallback to older patterns, patterns of, let's say, micro control, or patterns of disengagement and non-communication, or I guess for some people it's a pattern of over-mothering and over-control, and so you can go on. We use the Enneagram quite a bit through this whole journey to understand what it is, what are the various patterns in which leaders react and fall back, etc. So for me, those are almost, Liezel, some of the really key things is that it is so complex that we actually can't deal with it in our normal ways, and leaders will try to control the context in their normal ways, in trying to re-establish a kind of a normal, but it doesn't work, and will fall back onto older behavioral patterns, and it doesn't work, and feel probably very frightened, very lost, very overwhelmed. And at the same time, we sit with people in the organization, the employees of the organization, who are waiting for a leader. And if the leader doesn't appear, we start throwing around blame because we don't have leadership. Where's the leadership? Our leadership are terrible. etc., etc. And that's part of the dynamic. And I think it's part of the dynamic that's been set up over a very long time. It is we sort of dependent on leaders. You know, these high expectations of leaders. We expect leaders to be these super beings, and yet at the same time, we're also always quite angry or annoyed or disappointed with our leaders. And a big part of that is this split, I think. Vicenta spoke about that. Is the split and the projection. Is the government does things and we are just the poor victims of the government's decisions, or the leadership of the organization are doing things. And we are these helpless people who can't respond. And I think there is a big knot that over time probably needs to be worked with, untangled. We need to find new ways. And I think probably what emerged out of this time is, you know, we can't wait for leaders. We have to play the leadership role that's required of us. And we have to step into that. And we have to take responsibility for how we experience things. And all of those things are very difficult because they're always within incredibly complex contexts.
Beatrice, you had a comment. I don't know if you want to raise that.
Hi, sorry, I disappeared momentarily. Yeah, I just put a comment into the chat box about the concept of team has shifted. It's just in my, I'm dealing quite a lot with people on leadership development programs, on various business school programs with a couple of institutions. And the syndicate groups and people in coaching, or people who have been in coaching, are really feeling like leadership is not quite knowing how to lead them, but the concept of team has actually shifted. I think we're finding that quite a lot, even where you've got people who have to be at work, who have to be physically at work. And what does it mean when there's a contingent of people who are physically in a workplace, in a warehouse, in a manufacturing entity, for example, but there's an entity working from home or virtually or remotely that has to interact with the bit that is physically working somewhere. Managers or leaders are really grappling in terms of how to make this dynamic work. And what people have started to see happening, and what they're reporting to people like myself in coaching sessions, is that managers are just getting into a kind of control spiral where they are trying to keep tabs on people. So people are saying to me things like, you know, I used to be in the office, and if I went away for a quick break or a smoke break or popped down to the canteen or whatever, nobody cared. Now that I'm working virtually, if I don't immediately answer a WhatsApp message or immediately answer my phone, I get this irritated message saying, "Where are you?" So the concept of team and the concept of leadership is changing, I think, a fair bit. And I think that there are certain team leadership competencies, back to basics team leadership competencies, that people need to be acquiring again. And there are conversations that are not happening. There are conversations that have ceased to happen. I think there are lots of conversations that need to be starting, but who starts the conversation and how does it get facilitated? And I'm a panel speaker in a webinar tomorrow evening for a specific institution. And one of the things I'm going to be chatting about is, we've seen so much focus on conversation in the last couple of years, 2-3 years. We've had handling difficult conversations. We've had courageous conversations. We've had a focus on crucial conversations. What is the conversation that is needing to be had now? I think that is a question I'm posing during the webinar that I'm on tomorrow, and letting people grapple with that a little bit, and who starts the conversation. So that's just coming from the comment that I posted in the chat box. And thanks for the opportunity to go into it a little bit. Thanks.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear what your audience comes up with tomorrow, Beatrice. So what is that conversation that needs to be happening?
Yeah, I'll certainly provide feedback around the thoughts that come out of that. Yeah.
I'm also, as you speak, I'm curious about what is the idea of team that's emerging? What do we mean when we speak of team? And inside that context, what do we mean when we speak of team leadership? Because I think we've been throwing so much stuff onto leadership, so many ideas onto leadership. We've actually overburdened the whole concept of leadership. It's become this, you know, in the past few, probably in the past decade, with the whole rise of leadership development as an industry, probably since the early 2000s, the leader has been elevated into this truly mythical concept. You know, even if we speak of servant leader or, you know, whatever it is, it is this overburdened concept with this incredibly high expectation for this sort of super being who can be selfless and who can be a good communicator, and etc., etc., etc. And in a way, that responsibility is shifting back to the team or to the group. Like a decrease of dependency. I'm curious about your question, who must start this conversation? The leaders who must start it. Or are the people who start the conversation the leaders, de facto, etc.?
Mike, share with us what you're putting in the chat box there.
I'm very intrigued about a couple of things that have been mentioned, and I just made some notes here. This double bind unresolvable issue and stuff. The comment I made was that now stuff doesn't go away. Leaders have relied, and I've been in leadership development for 30 years within an organization, developing new talent. And one of the things that happens is that we devise with our OD communities, organizations that have leaders expecting to pass on work, responsibility, alignment, engagement, and this team that you talk about is supposed to take stuff away and make it happen. That's why we have scorecards and we have everything else that we've set up for people to devolve this whole issue. And now with the lockdown, all of a sudden I'm trapped in my family. I'm trapped in my home situation. I'm dealing with children, schooling, and all of a sudden everybody else's children and everybody else's schooling. And I can't let go of the concept of letting go. You know, this issue of I've been really scripted into my success in having designed this organization and put everything in place for stuff to happen. Now it's not. And it's a very different situation. So I revert back to my scripting on saying, and I take some of this from a client that I worked with for a while now over the last year, a very small business, family business, CEO, who's also the managing director and owner, has a son working in the business, and had been struggling for a while and now had to survive. And the individual's natural scripting and personality came through so violently that the coaching had to be about how do you really control the fact that you are not in control and that you're supposed to save the livelihoods and the families of all these people. We're only talking 18 odd people. and make this business sustainable, yet you are also in this situation. You know, this crunch all of a sudden becomes really real. I can't separate myself through the organizational design and my leadership design. I'm now immersed in this process. And the last comment was about what I've learned out of the Global Team Coaching Institute course that I've just done, the startup course that I've just finished. And there, Hawkins and Katterbuck took us through, and they did the personal lecturing through those sort of 6-7 weeks, 7 sessions over 5 months. And one of the things that came out for me very strongly is this concept of, have we as an OD community truly got to grips with what a team is? Because if you really go back and you start looking at this issue and you start to say, we devise and design teams in structure and purpose and everything else, but are they a team? Are they just a group? Are they a mismatch and integration of the supply chain? Or are they truly a team? And what came out of that for me was the team going forward has to understand that their key understanding is that they serve as a team the entire stakeholder community that they work with. And therefore, they've got to bring more of that stakeholder community in. So here you have this collaboration need to truly understand what's going on. And you can see it playing around in the political situation at the moment. And around the process. And in that, it seemed to come up with the sessions I had, practicum sessions I had with people in Europe, in the USA, in Asia, on this program. All are struggling with this concept of how do you truly devise whether this is a team and whether they are combining their effort to truly understand what their team end in mind is and how they work together, or are they just working with what we've always said is the value statements and objectives on the wall? What is it that they take responsibility for? And I think what you're seeing now and what you've been describing, may be wrong, is a concept of, has the leader really truly got to grips to let go and to be comfortable enough that the entire team takes responsibility and runs with that? Because now they're in a situation where they can't just hand it over. They're locked in their homes and they've got to make this thing work. So those are the things that resonated with me around what you've just said.
It's so interesting when you speak about the team boundary, the idea of the team boundary or group. And in a way, we also started working using this word team instead of the word group. And there's a whole conversation around that, because I think there's a lot of moot points there. One of the things that Sonia mentioned was the challenge of where does one system stop and another begins. So where are the boundaries between different systems? Where is there openness between systems and where is there separation between systems? And to what extent do systems become entangled with each other? And those are incredibly complex things. And those are things, I think, per definition, that the single leader cannot resolve. Those things can only be resolved through these kinds of conversations. Liezel, I see there was something from Janie as well. That
very interesting, that one.
Intrigues me. Yeah. I would love to know what kind of structural systemic flaws do you see, Janie?
And loss of agency has been one of the big themes we've been working with throughout this whole period. In different contexts, in different forms has it come up, but this loss of agency is such a big thing. Yeah, Janie, please speak to us about it.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think for me, one of the things around how organizations are structured and how decisions get made, what is surfaced, and I think very much my experience with this has been more within the state-owned entity sector, where people are leaders who are expected to lead teams and ensure performance, almost feel trapped and are not willing to make decisions, and so they vacillate all the time. And so a lot of the conversations you're having with them is around, but your position entitles you or requires you to make a call on this, and you have the agency to make the decision. But because structurally the organization, and I guess a lot of it has to do with the political space in which state-owned entities are operating, there's a reluctance to make decisions, and so things get deferred and deferred. And people doing the work, teams doing the work, just get absolutely frustrated, and that's impacting morale of the team. And so I think it's the way decision-making structures are set up in organizations that are particularly damaging at this stage. And I think the pandemic, lockdown, and remote working has just made this more evident, because in the past you could quickly hustle together and make things happen because everyone was in the same space, whereas now you're not. And so it's exposing this fundamental flaw around decision-making structures in organizations and accountability very much. And that's been my experience, particularly within the state-owned entity sector.
It's almost like in bureaucratic settings, and in the bureaucratic contract, there's these two parts. The one part is the organization is set up in a very clumsy way, with all of these checks and stops, and then the culture of the organization is set up in such a way that one of the highest priorities for any leader is to avoid making mistakes, and therefore to not making, and to cover your back, basically, to cover your back. And, and there's something fundamental around the contract that needs to shift.
Absolutely. You know, I think it's and so that fear of failure or getting it wrong and feeling exposed and vulnerable, I think, amongst leaders is a big thing that needs to be dealt with. And I think my experience with coaching has been beneficial in that sense, in that it's helped leaders to somehow feel a little bit more secure. But there's always that inherent fear factor of, if I get this wrong, how exposed am I? And what does that mean for my livelihood? And I think it was Richard that said earlier, you know, our leaders are in this thing with their teams. It's not like they are immune to the economic ramifications of what the current operating context is. And so it's quite a tricky one for leaders to navigate.
Yeah. And something you said, Janie, that's very interesting is that even though they have the agency, they still don't make the decisions because the structure doesn't allow for it. And I just find that fascinating thinking. We usually say you either have agency or you don't, but then on the other hand, the structure, so I'm thinking the Worldview E&A framework here for those that know it. Does the structure allow for agency? And does it need agency, and does it want agency? Which makes me think of Julia's talk, was it last week or the week before, on leadership stuckness, where we talked about if an individual enters into an organization, there's a utilitarian contract almost relationship. We need this from you, so you bring this and we will give you this in return for this. The organization does not expect you to bring your whole self. Not often does an organization actually want you to bring your whole self. And as the process then goes, at some point something shifts in the system and things are not going well, and the individual if they're not useful anymore, gets ejected out of that system, which is again even less agency, which talks to this structural thing of what did we say? It was a double message: is fit in or you will get fired. But fit in is already leave your agency at the door, because we do things a certain way here. We don't want your whole self. We want, and she talked about amputation of identity to fit into a system, which then impacts this whole agency thing. So I'm finding this very fascinating.
It's almost a double bind as well. Is the organization says, I'm going to measure you on performance, and you've got to perform, and you've got agency, and there are these things that you may do. But in reality, everyone is checking you, and the message that you actually get is that you have to conform, and you must not rock the boat, and you must watch out around you. And I think Liezel, what you touch on, and Janie, what you also mentioned is this, that you almost become self-disempowering, that you undermine your own agency, you give up your own agency. And it's almost for me, when Jacinta and I had a conversation about organizational trauma, for me there's a kind of a trauma link in there as well. If you understand trauma as a process of maladaptation, where you really give up agency because you consider it not safe enough to have agency, and then that becomes a whole systemic thing. So it's completely unconscious. It's not as if it just happens, because it's this cultural force in the organization. These cultural patterns that develop over time, where everyone knows, you don't say that in that meeting. You don't make that kind of decision, even if you can, because someone else will very quickly stick in the knife if that decision is wrong. So you rather pass it up.
Yeah, Mike, I want to come to the trust thing in a minute. I just want to continue here with one of the themes we also saw very early on in our check-ins that is still emerging and still sticking its head out and very aligned to what we're talking about now, is this idea of and I'm quoting somebody that was on our check-in: my currency lies in remaining relevant. So this was right at the beginning of the lockdown, where suddenly there was, do I have any value? Because suddenly, for example, a position like L&D is just pushed to the background. It's not important now. It's operational. We need to open. We need to keep going, that kind of thing. And how that's been playing out throughout, where some people went there quite early on. And for some, it took quite a while to realize, oh my goodness, I thought after 3 or 5 weeks, I'll be back and I'll be important again, or my position will be important again. Where now there's people that says, I'm, in Julia's words from the leadership stuckness talk, she uses the word fudgeable, which means irreplaceable. And where people are starting to say, I'm just a number and I have no value. I'm so replaceable. And what that's doing to staff morale and engagement, because at some point, there'll be some training again or whatever the thing might be, but at the moment, so many people that I'm talking to and that's been on our check-ins and our talks, they're just feeling they have no value. They've got nothing to add. So if your currency, or you see yourself as your currency lies in remaining relevant, but you have not been able to add value or be relevant for 6 months, where are those people sitting now? And what will that impact be in organizations?
Yeah, I've got some scattered thoughts on all of this that kind of look at all these elements that you've been talking about. Is we've almost been told, and like you were talking about contracting, Christo, that you leave your home and then you enter into a different contract with your workspace. It only needs very certain elements of you. Lockdown and having to work from home has obliterated that. Now all of a sudden, all the elements of your life are part of your work. Whether you have a dog that's barking in the background or children or those kind of things, it's changed how you've got a contract. And maybe that's where the conversation's got to start between workplaces and work, because the whole of you now has to be part of it. You can't separate yourself from your work life. Those two aren't separate anymore. And that's how we've all, I mean, I do it. I work very hard at, like, that's work and this is not work. And I don't think that's very healthy, because now you can't separate it. You can't separate those two things, and you've got to recontract, essentially. And if you try and work on the old system, it's going to fail every time, because your expectation and reality are not aligned at all. My mind's been sort of turning over as everyone's been talking. It's very, very interesting.
Beatrice?
I think what you've just raised is so key critical, Richard. And one of the things that I've been spotting in interactions with people is there was a high level of tolerance for the sort of work from home, bring your whole life into the workspace scenario to start off with. The kid coming along to say hello was cute. The dog barking in the background was fun, etc., etc., etc. And all of a sudden, what I've started seeing is a complete and utter lack of tolerance for some of these things now. We don't want to know about your home life. Yes, it is Saturday morning, and we don't actually care that you're busy with family stuff at the moment, because we've got a real crisis here that we need to be handling, or whatever it is. And suddenly, you know, the family entity and the cuteness and the humanness of working from a family-oriented environment, I am finding in conversations with people now is kind of dissipating. People don't want to know about your home stuff anymore. They don't want to know about the complexities that you're involved with. They just want you to be this person that's involved in the Zoom meeting, attending to the stuff or whatever. I think what you're raising is so critical. And I think for me, part of the conversation has to be, and I posted a comment around, you know, the always on organizational culture used to feel sexy to a lot of people. And now I don't think it's feeling that sexy anymore. It's feeling like imposed conditions. So I think you've got quite a conflict starting to develop between this thing, but I've tasted the not always on, and I actually want a bit more of that. But I am accountable and I'm responsible, but you want me to be always on. And actually, I don't want to be. There's a lot of conflict, I think, going on in people's minds that is not being verbalized. Thanks.
Yeah, very true.
Before I forget, can I make a comment on that speaks to that? Is I think businesses want that. They don't want the personal element. They don't want the human element, because that makes doing business a hell of a lot easier. And to have a healthy business, you really need to recontract that. You're not just taking a technical skill from somebody when they come to a workplace. You're taking that whole person. And the human side, businesses need to contract that contract has to be human. It can't just be transactional. You come here and you crunch numbers, then you go away. I don't want to hear about whether your child died or your grandmother's sick or whatever, because that makes And it boils down to an eventual point of, it makes it harder for the business to then let you go or get rid of you if there's a human element involved. And I think healthy businesses going forward are contracting in a human way with human beings, and all of those elements are in play.
No.
And I think it's a place the whole world needs to go to. Otherwise, we will just follow this path, and the ending is not great.
I want to give Toto a chance. I see a raised hand there.
Thank you, Liezel, and good morning, everyone.
Welcome.
Yeah, I think just taking from what Richard has said earlier on to say there are two environments, and my experience has been that, I mean, when you are at work in the office environment, there's a manager and there's all the executives, and people, although they may be feeling they own what they do, but for the fact that it's an office environment, the manager wants to see himself doing work and feeling that level of authority. They tend to do what I call to congest the system, because they need to get things moving. They go into meeting, they need maybe some a pitch or briefing documents, and so they tend to be in control, and one get acclimatized to that environment to say, even if the email come, before sometimes you even respond, you go to your man and say, no, I received an email from so and so. They say, but what do you think? And that's the work environment, and that's how people get raised. That's how most of us grew up, because there's a manager in the office. You cannot go to finance and query a payment because maybe the CFO has spoken to your manager about it. But now, then lockdown happened. You're on your own. You've got your working tools, and such things happen. And all of us, or most of us, you home, you have your children, you have your social world. Like Richard was saying, you brought now everything next to you. Your dog is barking, your 2-year-old is happy that you are here every day. Now, when such situations happen, remember now the world is moving, work is going on. When that thing happens, your manager has also their own life to live at that time. They expect you to sort of all of a sudden, boom, rise out of to the occasion and start attending to those. And if you don't, like I think it's Beatrice who was saying, even if somebody send you a WhatsApp or phone you around 10 to 8 and you don't answer, it means, where are you? Because I'm home. I decide I work from 9 o'clock unless if there's anything. Now, everyone expects any other person to be doing 3 times more than what they were doing. Now, the question is, were these people ready? Were you ready to let go as a manager in the office environment? Did you prepare this person to work on their own at any given time? But also in terms of me as an official or as a staff member, how do I now begin to integrate taking responsibilities? Because there's no time for me going to somebody's desk and inquire. We make decisions. And then I've been saying even to my supervisor this morning to say, I'm gonna take a risk. I'll write a letter, you sign. If it doesn't go well, we'll see what we can do, because we need to be decisive. If we're not decisive, we cannot go back to the office environment and say, let's talk about this again. Because some people are already having that fatigue of having Zoom meetings every single day. Because previously you'll have two, three meetings in a day, and that was fine. Nowadays we have like 4 or 5 meetings a day. There is no conference that we don't attend because it's virtual. Otherwise, if a conference is in Cape Town, you don't go. I mean, last week I was surprised. I attended 3 international conferences, meaning the whole week. There was a day on Friday, I had 2 conferences happening in one day. And both of them I had a session to participate in. One was happening. So it's a question that if I was in the office, was my boss going to say, go to Italy, I'll go to Cape Town? We were going to share. But now I must attend to them because it's part of my work. So it's a question of a mindset at this time for me doesn't work. It's part of the solution. What works more is, are you able to? Are you prepared? And also in terms of now the practitioner who is the boss, did he give you a room to maneuver or a space to grow so that when you have to stand on your own, you don't drown? So yeah, that's actually my view on that for now.
Sure.
Who would like to respond?
You know, at the beginning when we went into lockdown, and it's something that came out when we had the conversation with Lucille as well, is it was an opportunity to just stop doing all the things that we are doing. And I think we, in our fear and in our reactiveness in organizations, we've done exactly the opposite. Is we have stopped and we have just, I remember that first month, it was just setting up infrastructure, you know, making sure everyone can be connected, etc., etc., etc. And then there's this fear that Liezel, you mentioned earlier, am I relevant? That question. So now I have this fear that I won't be relevant. So I have to start finding all sorts of ways to be busy and to learn things and to do etc., etc., etc. And yet at the same time, what this period potentially offered us was to stop, to not do, to think, must we do all of those things? Are those things really necessary? What is really important in terms of what we must do and what we must not do? And it is, Toto, I find it like deeply, deeply frustrating all the time that we don't stop. It is like we just got more mad in this time. And we are just doing more irrelevant things. And we are just less selective about what we are doing. Well, we must actually be highly selective about what we are doing. Even more selective about what we are doing. And it is this, I don't know, it's this obsession to recreate a new normal. And to force this new normal into existence, which is actually just a little bit like the old normal. And just more insane. So for me, what's happening in the work space around all of that is really troublesome. And then you add to it, you know, in the past, in terms of the contract, you could say, okay, the organization looks after me, they give me employment, I've got fairly safe employment, I play the political games in the organization, I must be obedient, I must fit in, etc., and I'll move up, and eventually I'll become more and more senior, and I'll have a bigger and bigger pension, and I'll be okay. And now we say to people, you must give your whole life out of the organization, and by the way, good chance, we're just going to let you go. So what's the deal? What's the deal here? I don't see the deal. I struggle to see the deal. And something that continues to come up with me here is I'm wondering all the time, who are they? You know, who are they who are expecting this of us? Who are the managers? Who are the leaders? To what extent is the system and separate from us? So there's this big separation that takes place. And that puzzles me. Mike, I see.
Yeah, Christo, I find that quite interesting because there are a couple of things that resonate in that. I have a distinct impression from the few people I've been dealing with that all of a sudden everybody in the world is more aware of where their customer base is. Lower down in the organizations, massive organizations who were systems within systems, and people were buried and just did their part of the supply chain, all of a sudden at home and in terms of what was going on, were aware that South Africa, let's just take South Africa or the world at large, was shrinking economically to such a large extent. And that creates even more context to their worry about what's going on. And I see in, again, the few conversations I've had, that people, the managers themselves don't step into that space. They're not geared to step into the space to say, we are a strong entity, we will find alternatives, we will look for these issues, let's just bed ourselves down, let's get our internal systems going. So you have inside the organization this whole issue of the anxiety that is raised because people all of a sudden are aware of their direct customer. And then if I look at organizations that have been going through trauma of survival for a number of years before this happened, I think if you did the evaluation, they handled it a lot better if their engagement and communication factor was better, because they knew they were on the edge all the time. Everybody in the organization knew they were adding value. Those organizations were comfortable, have taken huge trauma with this internal boil that's taken place to say, I was working here, but now I know that, you know, the marketplace is falling out. So what do I do? That's an interesting dilemma for me.
And
it's an interesting point that organizations that have been going through trauma, and I assume it's organizations that have actually dealt with that trauma to a certain extent, are in a better position going through this. It's less of a surprise for them.
But Christo, I definitely think there's something in that. The business show that I always listen to, the Pablo Fatidis, his theme 2 weeks ago or something was that the small businesses that he works with, that he sees is surviving, are those that's been survivalists for quite some time. Because exactly like Mike said, you know that you are as small and as tight and as agile as you can be, and everybody is adding value because we were already on the brink or on the edge. And therefore this is like another blow, but we can do this because we've been doing it for 3 years or whatever. I mean, look at us. We've gone through the most horrendous turmoil in the past 4 years. And I think there's definitely some truth in if you've been fighting hard to survive, then it would have been a little bit easier to now take on another fight. Unfortunately, if you were on the survivalist edge, this might have pushed you over that edge financially, you know. But I think the internal resilience of organizations were, but also, like you said, if that trauma has been handled or handled well. So if it's an organization that's just been through something hectic like massive retrenchments or something, and it wasn't handled very well, then this extra trauma might have just like spun them into something that's not survivable. Mike, I see you've unmuted yourself.
If I could just add, I did some coaching right at the end of last year with a parastatal, and in the executive management level, very large parastatal. that had been influenced by this whole review of skullduggery that was taking place at senior management, and people were taken out at the top of the organization. And this executive group, the group that I was coaching, displayed exactly what we're talking about. The inability to deal with this trauma above them and delivery below them, and having never experienced this before, never experienced the resilience you require and the ability as a management team, a senior management team, not like a corporate executive team, but a really senior team driving infrastructure. And it was chaos, absolute chaos. And you had to bring them back to really thinking about their value statements, their ability. And we're talking about people who were incredibly well educated and experienced. Some of them with 30 years of experience, with MBAs and the like, honors, really, really competent people just found themselves at a loss. So they hadn't developed that resilience. And I haven't heard now how they're dealing with that, but I would imagine those people are far worse off than organizations that have built that ability.
It links to, it hooks up with the resilience conversation that we had with Sharon, Lucille and Sharon's resilience conversation. Also, in Sonia's conversation, the point of identity, Mike, is something that I'm beginning to hear strongly as well. Is how do you ensure identity coherence in a time like that? And Sonia spoke about the value guardrails as a source of some level of coherence, identity coherence. And you spoke earlier about trust in the comments, and it seems to link for me to that question of trust as well, as it's almost like a condition, and it's a condition that cannot exist in the absence of a certain sense of identity and a certain a certain structure of values, and that in many cases this has been really, really disrupted because it has not been imported in organizations, in many organizations. We paid lip service to it, but what the organization has been expecting from people has been something different, and now that they're faced with that capacity, the capacity to survive, the capacity to persevere, the tenacity, the ability to recover from setbacks, all of those things they're just not in place.
Roy?
Yeah, I was just listening to, challenging the notion of leadership and the concept of teams and resilience. And I looked down at my notes, and it's Enneagram 7's brain explosion. But some of the things that I've noticed upon reflecting, over the last 6 months, I zoomed out to make sense of it. And there was this massive polarity of things and varying degrees in between. So you were either hopeful or you were fearful. You were resilient or you were burnt out already. The leader was controlling or let go of control. So there's this massive polarity and different influences that sparked the way in which people responded to the lockdown and the crisis as it unfolded. But I think from a personal resilience perspective, if you zoom out and you say, well, where is the control? You think, as an actor in a complex system, my locus of control is internal. And if you look at the notion of leadership and teams, it's not static. So at any point in time, I might be completely low on energy and personal resources. So another team member may slot in to that role at that point in time. Or the leader is sort of putting out fires elsewhere. Another team member may slot in and fulfill that role at that point in time. So the enabling constraints would be, you know, let's survive, let's get through this. But the notion of leadership and team has been in flux, and the identity as you flip through those roles has been challenged. So yeah, I think from an individual perspective, those who have done well and those who haven't, is what resources did I have before I came into lockdown? A company might have more money, or the person might have more savings. Was I energized, or was I already on the verge of burnout or on the edge? And did I come into the system as an actor from the perspective of victim or parent or collaborator, and how that's sort of played out in various points? And you may just kind of flip between those perspectives, you know, feeling victimized by lots of meetings, zero tolerance for my home life. You know, I'm on 50% salary, but I'm working 3 times as hard, and, you know, but I feel victimized by all of this. Or is it a, you know, over-controlling parent type role or collaborator? So something's wrong, let's do something about it, let's have a conversation. So those are some of the things I've noticed from the reflections on our notes, linking to leadership and team and stuff like that, and the personal resilience.
Mm. And it's very interesting that the victim mentality thing has come up a lot of times, right? And also it has also changed. It was also different people at different stages felt more or less like a victim. But that also links to that the leader as the scapegoat. So is it just finger pointing and blame? Does the individual have agency? Does the structure allow the individual to have agency? And then also, Roy, something that you said that I want to just think about for a second. Some of this was not necessarily just complex, it was chaotic. And in chaos, the leader is the first one who does something. And is that maybe where that agency sat for a while in this weird flux, where, like you said, maybe the leader was indisposed for some reason, putting out fire somewhere else. And the first one to act could become the leader in that moment and in that situation, until we go back to a place where things make a little bit of sense, and we can try and figure out by experimenting what to do next, kind of thing. And I wonder, yeah, agency and resilience are two things that's very sits next to each other.
Yeah, you have the energy to act. But I thought about, you know, does the structure allow for resilience? And I've in a agency, and I had a conversation in a public enterprise, and where there's a will, there's a way. So various people in the organization sort of flipped out of the structure and did what they needed to do to get it done. And in retrospect, like looking backwards, they said, well, we have to justify this. So the example is the skills development levy. you know, and that scorecard has to rely on accredited qualifications and learning. But they had flipped into a digital learning solution because people had to carry on. But the platform wasn't accredited. So they said, well, you know, we are investing in learning. We are investing in our people. SARS must just have a conversation with us and meet us halfway. So groups were self-organizing to get things done in spite of the structure. So the structure fell away where the need was greater than the structure's sort of boundaries. So that was a great example of, you know, how agency is playing out in spite of structure. So they broke the structure to get things done.
It's very interesting if the need is greater than the structure allowed, then people would step outside. That's also courage, hey? This needs to be done. Let's just step outside of this thing.
Yeah, and it's a bureaucratic process. I mean, to kick up against that structure takes tremendous force. Whether they're going to win the battle or not is another story. But it was very heartening to see that, you know, bureaucratic structure wasn't going to get in the way of serving the people in that organization.
Oh, it's Christo.
Yeah, no, it's my family life.
Can I say something? I was typing, but it's easier just to say something
Please,
about the skills issue.
Yeah.
I think because I'm in that environment, and at the moment with education at various levels on different structures, and it resonated back to my career on this issue and how few people understand this link, and I'm going to use the wrong language, this link between a structure and bureaucracy that has developed for a particular closure of gaps in getting to the end in mind. So the end in mind of accreditation is authenticity of the result. The guy that comes out has a certificate that has to be authentic and able to do the rigor of standing up to that. So when the thing goes pear-shaped, as we see people doing, they move into an environment to say, how can I get around the structure, rather than understanding the need and then saying, well, let's find a new way to get to the same authenticity in another way, in another field. And those people that are doing that, I work with the Protech, math science technology, and we've had to move that entire NGO process onto online. And you're working with the Department of Basic Education and you're driving education in that field, yet you need to be really aware that you are still working for the students passing the exam at the end of the day. So how do your systems then align to achieve the same result in a different way? And that has been the difficulty in getting people to think out of the norm, rather than, well, almost controlling them not to go into finding new ways within the system, rather than they're going around the initiative to develop a system that still meets that need and then selling that idea. And that takes time. We know bureaucracy takes time to sell that idea. So in the skills environment, for instance, the key there in terms of grants and everything else, and I'm on that board as well of a big seater, the surprising issue is the number, thousands of organizations that have got a mindset around the bureaucracy of the system or the process, and not thinking about why it was there in the first place. So we continually, and it happens in organizations, we continually build, put fingers in holes in the dike, and then we forget the fingers there, for the hole that should have been fixed in the first place, rather than put a new policy or finger in there, if you understand what I mean. So when I come to the fact that the finger breaks and it starts to leak again, I don't go back to the original cause and effect and try and fix it there. I'm never getting to the root cause of what was the aim in the first place. So we've evolved in resilience and agility, but we've got to remember what the end of the process should have looked like and where the root cause originally was, because we are evolving and forgetting some of the basics in leadership. Your human being needs to be able to interact with AI. Why? Why do they need to do that? Because they need to fit into a role. Now, all of a sudden, you've got information coming out and so much information flowing. How do I get myself into a situation where somebody says to me, okay, we had a security breach 4 months ago with Zoom. Now Zoom's out of the question because IT says it's out of the question. But they fixed that. We've moved on. What's the key? You know, that kind of flexibility doesn't happen. We put the finger in the hole, we close the hole because there was a breach, but we never look at what the intent was and what do we need to go back to. People don't like to reflect. They don't like to reflect on that issue. So it's very complex, but we have scripted our organizations. Leadership has scripted the organizations to almost play a rugby game. There's the try line. Let's have a scrum. Let's move fast. And, you know, if you look at those sports analogies, they go back to basics at the end of the day. And how far have we moved away from that? What is the authenticity behind skills development? And then how do we persuade people that a new system can work and move forward, rather than just our change philosophies of saying, okay, let's take all this change methodology we have, work through it and get to the end in mind. And we have an 18-month change process to get ourselves into a digital environment. We had a week's notice of lockdown. We didn't have 18 months to do change. You know? Interesting, anyway.
Yeah, a quote that I wrote down from one of our check-ins as well, where somebody said, it's like putting the tech or systems, I guess, horse in front of the purpose. No, it's like putting the tech cart in front of the purpose horse. And we see that happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting something that you mentioned, Mike, about that strikes me is almost like is the question of what is it that we expect from leadership? What is it that we expect from leaders? What makes a good leader? What is this thing? Because it seems to me that on the one hand, we've scripted it into such a narrow little story. And on the other hand, we do all of this development work. And what is the effect? What is it that we're trying to do? What is it that we're trying to shift, transform, enable? What is the kind of capacity that we are trying to develop in the organization with leadership? It's so quickly, and it becomes just a tick box exercise to satisfy certain systemic or bureaucratic requirements. So the thing flips. We're not working, the system is not working for us, we're working for the system. I think that's the thrust to a large extent of, we had 2 conversations with Dominic Heil. And those were well, complex conversations. It's complex ideas. But for me, at the heart of that is this thing of the way in which we become part of the technology. The technology we come to, and in that process, as we become part of the technology, we become dehumanized. We're losing the ability to be fully human. And to be fully human is to be creative. It is to be innovative. It is to be able to create our world and to shape the world in which we live and to take responsibility for the world in which we live. It is not to be just a resource. It is not to be just a cog in the machine. It is not to just fulfill some absurd requirement that at some point maybe made sense in a different kind of context. And we almost trapped, we created systems in which we are trapped because those systems are too slow for what's happening, or too clumsy, or too, and in some places too brittle for what is happening.
It's like the big oil tanker when we're supposed to be in little speedboats.
Yeah.
That kind of system, big and slow and hard to turn and hard to change course.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So if I may again, I'm talking too much unless somebody else has got something to say.
No, it's fine.
That whole leadership thing, having been involved from the early days with you guys, and then for 20 years of my career in internal leadership development of young talent, and seeing some of that young talent come into executive positions now, 5 years later, after my retirement, is quite gratifying. But I'm reflecting back against a passion of mine that I posted just now around this concept of collaboration. And I'm going to make a very bold statement. The absolute loss of integrity around what collaboration really means, scripted by our concepts of control. And, we've been talking about how organized operation and how we work, and we can think about it in numerous ways. But for me, this whole collaboration issue, if you can get people to really understand that collaboration and the ability to collaborate on a leadership front, and you work through building that capacity to, first of all, have the self-awareness as a leader, to be able to manage that, to be able to manage continually trust building relationship in your trustworthiness and your engagement. So all of the other things that we've worked with, all the ways in which we have defined what leadership skills, leadership competencies are. But if you can build to a point where people understand, so what does it mean to truly collaborate as a win-win partnership arrangement? And what do you need to do to get away from the document that you've created to manage that for you going forward versus your leadership responsibility in totality with your teams, and whoever's working in that area, whoever has been given the responsibility to work with that stakeholder group or bunch of stakeholder groups, that they are able to genuinely lead and manage in that environment with your leadership skills. I have this sneaky feeling that that is the elixir at the end of the tunnel, that if we could get that magic right, where people start to truly understand what it takes. And I'm busy desperately trying to write at the moment, and it's not working so well for me. But the concept of that is that there are some great examples out of China with WeChat, and how the Chinese put in the bureaucratic system of saying, this is the system we'll use, guys. We're going to use WeChat. And then the collaborative effect that created the opportunity for 750 million people with smartphones to use WeChat as a business platform. So in our businesses, what is it required around breaking our paradigms of democracy and all of these other things that we teach to say, what is that stable platform that you require as a leader to build so that your teams can collaborate to create value above that towards a purpose-driven environment? And how can you build that? Because then we can say, how do we build resilience within that space and within the stakeholder group? And it's very complex, but I think we've got to go to, and I keep using this stupid statement that I was taught years back by you guys, this moving beyond complexity to simplicity. And I mean, it means nothing unless you've got it in your head. But for me, it's about what is the simplicity that you can picture as a purpose at the end of each of these strands of DNA that you're following, to be able to say, what the heck am I dealing with here? Because I can't survive in all of this complexity. I have to say, what is it that I want? And in the German example that I have in that environment as well, they've done the same thing. The Chancellor said, we're going on a strategy of 4IR. Okay, so this is 3 years ago, but that's it. So every business has to work on that. So they made certain foundational decisions and then built on that foundation. I'm asking the question, what is the leadership foundation that people have to say, we choose this and we stick with this? And we're not going to get sold a constant change process, because these are the kinds of things that hold this thing together. If we take away the foundation sometimes of our decision making and we make that complexity even deeper, then how do people in the organization actually manage through the mess that we've found ourselves in now? And all of the competencies are good. Everything is great. But if you want to collaborate with your stakeholders, if you want to form strategic partnerships with your stakeholders, you want to manage this process, whether you're forward integrating, backward integrating, you're working on value creation within your organization, your operational process internally, all of that cannot be done without understanding the collaborative effort that is required in the modern world. And I don't think we've got that right in our leadership development yet. But that's my point.
Toto, do you want to talk to your comment?
Yeah, just a bit. I was actually trying to think of, I think it's Christo who challenged me with his question, and which are real, to say what is a good leader during this crisis or during these situations. But and I went back to say, but there's a say that we always say, we are all leaders in our own rights, and whether you're leading or you're not, but whatever that you do, you take whole responsibility. And hence I said we need to make decisions and we need to make choices, because the reality is the world doesn't owe anyone a thing. We owe this to ourselves. And then I remember an article that I read few months ago, and I could remember one of the things that I say was that when we make those choices, it could be the opposite of what we are used to be doing. Hence, we need to be vulnerable to ourselves to say, I'm going to make this choice and I'm going to stick to it. But if it doesn't go well, then a great leader will be prepared to take criticism, whether it's positive or negative, but it depends on how do you want to respond to it. But also, in terms of people management and all that, which I'm not an expert, but I know one of the things is there should be a high level of honesty. There should be, people should exercise empathy in terms of how to treat each other, and the same goes to receiving the treatment towards you. But to be as clear as possible, to be simple, because I think we also complicate the situations around us, and once one does that, the whole world goes in circle. I mean, even at home, if I woke up in a very grumpy mood because of whatever that I didn't share with my kids or my wife, and I'm so moody in the morning, I'm closing them away. So the environment that I create is not simple for everyone around me, until such time that I make that decision to say, okay, I need to be honest, I need to be empathetic with these people, and I need to make a decision to say, okay, let me cool down, tell them what is happening. And the COVID-19 situations, it's still with us. We start with everything until when we get the vaccine, whenever. I always tell people I'll only relax by end of next year. But what do I do in the meantime? I don't stop breathing. So it's a question that we as leaders in our own right, we need to make those choices. And the part in short, I'm also thinking, putting myself in a space of a young person or any other person who stays alone, who migrated from somewhere, the Eastern Cape or wherever, and now this person is in Gauteng. The person stays alone. The only time he or she sees people, it's when they are at work. Because when you go to a mall or something, you cannot say you see people, because you just go there and get your necessities. This person will also have to make choices to say, do I start befriending my neighbors? Do I start getting a new circle of friends? Because your colleagues are at home. Everyone, most of the people are at home. So we as an individual, one, make that decision, get out of the comfort zone, go out, but carefully to make sure that you don't make those mistakes that will expose your vulnerability in such situations. So I think, and to write down things. I hate writing. I have to be honest. Although I'm trying to study for my PhD, but I hate writing. But lately, one thing that came a bit handy to me is the sticky notes on my laptop. I keep writing, okay, I want to do this, I want to do that. And I've got a clean sheet that I just call suspense. I just call it suspense. And that's where I would write everything that I would want to do. If something that I'm thinking, I'm busy working on something, then I think, I need to start profiling projects that I'm working on. I think it's a good thing because we are doing mostly virtual conferences. So before then, I would invite a researcher or somebody to say, you know what, we have a conference, why don't you come and showcase? So I need to start profiling. So I put everything on my suspense sheet. And this is something I never done before. So I made that decision and I'll go through with it. And hence I'm saying, before we even look at leadership, because we always do, and it's part of human nature, human creation. But what is it that I'm doing? What is it that we are doing from where we sit in to make sure that when this guy or I mean any person, a lady or so, when they come and they've made their own decision, how do they become part of our human existence? How do they become part of us without us feeling inferior or less important or any other negative thing? Because the decision will happen. So if they find you to have made a certain standpoint, a certain decision, then it becomes easy because you can even counteract, say, but I don't think we should go with this. We should rather go with it because one has made a decision on how they would want to proceed. So, I mean, there's no effect in terms of how we're going to deal with this until we are back to our normal life in the coming 2-3 years. So we need to try with what we have influence on and learn to love ourselves again. Yeah, that's that from my side.
I'm wondering if we're not maybe also overcomplicating things by trying to make sense of it the whole time. There's a lot at the moment that we don't know, and maybe just relaxing into not knowing and not having the answers. There's no ways we can have a definition for good leadership at the moment because we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. And the rest of the year, and what the economy is going to do, and what are we going to peak again, and what is this emerging normal going to look like? Because we're not there. There's a, what did we say yesterday? A now normal.
Next normal.
There's a next normal. There's a now normal and a next normal, and and it's all emerging. And maybe so this is the theme for me out of this conversation today is we don't know yet. We're still trying to, it's 6 months since lockdown, and we are still trying to just make sense and to figure this out. And maybe part of just lifting some of the burden would be to be okay with we don't know, and not to cling too tightly to rules and processes and things that worked before, and allow that to emerge. I do understand fully that on the other side of that balance, we do have to make a living. Businesses have to operate. And things have to move forward for the economy to also move again. So, yeah, not easy, I don't think.
I think a leader is going to be a different thing at a different time for a different purpose, and it's seldom going to be the same thing. You're going to be called a leader afterwards, not be made a leader in the beginning. And this is your job. So, you know, we could be a leader, a follower, a collaborator all in the same day. And you'll only know it afterwards. It's for a particular purpose at a particular time.
I agree fully. I think we sometimes stuck on this idea that we train up a leader and now they're a leader forever. And they must lead everyone from now until eternity. And the world we live in isn't like that. You have certain skills as a leader. And I think there's times when that needs to be at the forefront, and there's times when it doesn't need to be in the forefront, when other leaders need to take over. You know, if the world is obliterated and there's 10 people left on the world and you've got to find a way to survive, that's going to take a very specific kind of leader. But once the world repopulates and changes, that's going to take a different kind of leader. And it needs to be more fluid. Leadership definitely needs to be more fluid, and you can't, there's got to be a balance.
I think what Mike says there around people and how we interact with each other, for me somehow is at the heart of all of it. It is how are we human beings together? And then it doesn't matter really whether you are a leader or you are a follower or etc. It means that we come back to some basic or fundamental premise that in organizations, in families, in civilizations, in societies, we do things together. And we do things together as human beings doing things together. And we need to figure out things as human beings figuring things out. Yesterday I had a coaching session with a very young man who was asking me, you know, about what's this. He went down at some point into the difficulty of migration and refugees in different parts of the world, and how difficult it is for people who are so very different to live in the same spaces. And shouldn't we just give up on this idea of all liking each other and just stay apart? But that's not the reality of our world. The reality of our world is that we find ourselves in the same place, and that we need to work out these things that stand between us and that hold us apart and that keep us from collaborating and keep us from somehow coming to some kind of agreement about the kind of world that we want to live in. And that's not easy and simple work, and it is work that requires that we perhaps, a big part of this is that we really have to let go of the things that keep us from really connecting, relating to each other, encountering each other, the things inside ourselves. Because our world is still set up, we set up very defensively against each other. We want to connect to each other as leaders and followers and people in an organization, and we think it means to some extent that we have to control and dominate and get other people to do what we want them to do, and all of those kinds of I act on you rather than I and you, I encounter you, and we can find some way of working out what it is that we want and how we're going to go about it. In that sort of space, leadership is a micro moment. It is just a moment of going there and opening up that space in which we can connect to each other. So for me, Mike, that point of, that is where we need to grow. That is where especially we need to grow now. It means that we can't see each other as subjects or as resources or as, you know, people who will make us successful, or people that we have to influence and control. Even if we do all of those sorts of things, that can't be our starting point.
It's like that saying, the magic is not in the human, the magic is in the space between humans. Yeah, Mike, and I'm inviting any closing statements, points, and what you have heard.
I've loved the conversation. Thank you for that and everybody's input. I think the thing for me is just reinforces the fact that we focus on stimulating thought, not answering the question. And that's also a thing that leaders need to do more of, and we need to teach them to do more of. The thing that really resonates with me at the moment is a problem that we have in South Africa around the debates on why, in my early career, we talked about diversity and how we would solve all the problems 25 years ago of understanding each other and diversity, and yet the whole world, not just South Africa, the whole world seems to have missed the issue of an event rather than a process of growth and understanding, and how leaders are expected to control the fallout versus be able to engage in the context of pain that we go through in changing our mindsets and replacing what we have been scripted with in our environments as people across the whole spectrum of individuals, through families, to groups, to working teams, to countries, and so forth, and working out how to really embrace the truth of everybody else's reality without feeling that you've lost your own ability to have your own reality, and finding the ground to accept the humanness of what you've been through and what we're going through. And I think that also is a key issue in self-leadership, and we haven't got that right either. So there's a playing field around that which talks around how you have dialogues, how you have the confidence to accept others' opinions, to work towards moving that one ground isn't the right ground. We all have a reality, but what's the new human reality of our existence, and how do we live together? How do we grow together? How do we work together? And that to me is a massive failure on my part in being in leadership and being in OD for so many years and not seeing the growth of that. We just polarized the game, and we continue to look for the fight. Bless you. We look for the fight rather than the fun of exploring each other's diversity is probably the only word I have right now, but the complexity of diversity and the wonder of diversity of thought and experience and everything else. We just don't have the capacity, it seems, in our individual and our group leaders to be able to manage that very dynamic and very sometimes explosive debate and growth moving forward. You know, you don't have to replace what you've got. You have to accept that it's far richer with everybody else's experiences. And we don't have that. And that affects internally in our organizations, with an engineer that can't accept the accountant's way of thinking, you know, to the simplicity of a in-organization context rather than the societal context that we've got. But that for me is a fuse that the world of OD has to start thinking about. But that's my thing. So thanks so very much for stimulating my thoughts.
Great. Yeah, so we've come to close to the end of today's conversation. Toto, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, one other thing that I think it's always been left out. I actually tried to do a research on it a few years ago as part of my academic research, but I think I was frustrated because of how the environment is. I think we need to relook at business management processes. And the reason I'm saying that I mean, for now, I think it's been almost 6 years now that I've rejoined the public service. So I wanted to do a research on business process management, but I was frustrated that whoever people who are deemed to be the expert in the area were not hearing what I'm saying. But thinking of the outside world and where we are now, this is the perfect time to do. And I'm going back to what Richard has said in terms of how do we want to move swiftly and have a fluid leadership, that the business processes cannot be the same anymore. We need to get ourselves stuck out of what we are doing today or from the past. So that's the concept that I'm thinking it really needs to happen. But I think for me, it was a very good discussion. I must confess, OD, it's one of my first love. Unfortunately, I've never worked in that environment. I've never been a practitioner before, but it has always, I mean, I've gone to so many sectors in my just over 20 years career, but I've never been one. But it has always been my first love, in a sense. When somebody just talks OD, I hear what they say. So I think discussions like this are very enlightening. I'm learning a lot. So I look forward to the next one, but to say we need to be careful that as individuals, we don't put ourselves in so much strain that our bodies even get angry at us, that we cannot comprehend what we want to do. We cannot take what we want, what we have decided on. Hence, earlier on, I said we need to make decisions, but make sure that everything that we do is simple. Because once it's complicated, then that light at the end of the tunnel, it's not sunshine, it's an oncoming train. So yeah, so thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We still have Janie. Yeah, you're still there. Would you like to, you have any closing thought?
Yeah, I think I found the conversation quite interesting. I think the thing that stuck out for me really is that as leaders, we don't have to have all the answers. And I think it was Michael who made the point around we're creating stuff together. And I think it's possibly a trait that leaders need to start getting comfortable with around not having the answers and relying on the expertise that they have brought in to support them in making things happen, regardless of the sector or business you're in. So I think for me, that is one of the key takeaways that I'm taking away from me around how do I, in my coaching endeavors, enable leaders to develop that muscle more strongly, because I think that is possibly going to be the one thing that's going to support us greatly going forward. Thank you.
So true. Thank you. And then the only person who hasn't said anything, who's still on, is a screen called Flex. No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been great. It was a very nice conversation. It was so nice to unpack all these months of listening, and it's amazing how intertwined the themes are. They're not separate themes. They all link into all of the conversations we had.
Thanks very much, guys. Thanks
everyone.
Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Okay,
Yeah.
bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.